Good evening to everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name's Amanda Steele, and I am the president of the Federalist Society here at Columbia Law School. I want to thank you all for coming. I think this is going to be a really great debate. We have two really dynamic speakers and a really interesting topic. Before we get started, though, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the night, and that is Professor Philip Hamburger. Again, for those of you who don't go to Columbia Law School, I'll go ahead and run down a few of the credentials for you. Professor Hamburger graduated, got his bachelor's at Princeton, and then went to Yale Law School. He joined us last year, and he came from the University of Chicago. He teaches our 1Ls constitutional law, and he teaches our 2Ls and 3Ls, smaller seminars, I think predominantly sort of religious liberties courses. For those of you who do go here, you're already very familiar with Professor Hamburger, I'm sure. He has become a really integral part of our faculty here over the course of the past year. He is our advisor, so he has been just great for us. He's always agrees to moderate or participate in debate when we need him, and he's always been there if we need suggestions on speakers or debate topics, and he's always more than willing to contact any of the speakers if we don't have the pull to get them here ourselves. So it is my especially distinct honor to introduce Professor Hamburger. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure not only to be here, but to welcome all of you. Thanks for coming. Our discussion today will be on civil rights and urban education. And we have two remarkable speakers to help us think about these issues. Our first speaker is going to be Harold Ford, Jr. Harold Ford is a professor of public policy at Vanderbilt University. He also is chairman of the Democratic Leadership Council and vice chairman of Merrill Lynch. He's served Tennessee in the United States Congress for 10 years. And he's been described by President Clinton as the walking, living embodiment of where America ought to go in the 21st century. That's quite something. We should be especially pleased to have him here. He's served on financial services and budget committees. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, where he got his BA in American history and a law degree at the University of Michigan. Well, no one's perfect. He's a regular contributor to Fox News. And he lives in Memphis and Nashville, and his offices in New York and Nashville. So I guess he travels a lot. We also have with us, as a second speaker, Clint Bolick. Clint Bolick recently launched the Goldwater Center for Constitutional Litigation in Phoenix, and he will serve as counsel with the Rose Law Firm in Scottsdale, Arizona. He is quite busy. He's also at the Hoover Institution, where he's a fellow. And he formerly was the president and the general counsel for the Alliance for School Choice. Since its inception, which is on May 17th, 2004, which is the 20th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, the Alliance has helped enact or expand 19 school choice programs across the country and has provided new educational opportunities for tens of thousands of disadvantaged students. Clint Bolick has co-founded and served as litigation director at the Institute for Justice, where he, again, defended school choice programs. And among the other cases that he litigated was one that I suspect we will discuss tonight, which is the Zellman case concerning vouchers in Cleveland. It's one, in fact, that I teach a number of times. He's been the recipient of the Bradley Prize, and he's written a host of books. One of them is Voucher Wars, Waging the Legal Battle Over School Choice. And then there's a more intriguingly titled one, it is fiction, Nikki's Girl in 2007. So, before we get going, let me just say a few words about the nature of the debate, or I should say really a discussion, because what we're really doing here, I suspect, is not fighting over set positions, but just trying to explore the realities and trying to understand it better. The problem is that even 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education, we face some problems. Brown versus Board of Education may have resolved the questions about race, but there seem to be underlying questions about economics, questions of law, questions of educational policy that are still with us. And in particular, amongst these problems, we see a gap between urban and suburban schools. And that's sobering. It's not good for the nation. It's certainly not good for the students. And I think all of us who are teachers should be worrying about it. And then the question becomes, well, what's the solution? And then it's by no means clear what the answer should be. We have programs, No Child Left Behind, for example, but how efficacious is it? What is it actually doing? Some people will suggest that what's really needed is more spending. And in fact, jurisdictions across the country, and not least, of course, the federal government, have engaged in a fair amount of spending. But to what effect? The problems remain. And so the question that we have to discuss tonight is whether 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education, we need to be thinking more expansively about some of these matters, outside the normal boxes of law and our preconceived notions. Among the things we'll have to discuss tonight are, in fact, educational policy, money, and law, and religion, and no doubt a host of other things. But I'm going to stop talking now and turn us over to our first speaker. The speakers, I think, will be talking for 10 minutes each, and then they will have 5 minutes each to respond, and then I'll be posing some questions to them. Then we'll be taking a break, and then there'll be a chance for all of you to ask some questions. So without further ado, let me give you Mr. Ford. Thank you. Thank you.
Professor, thank you for the introduction of both me and Clint. And thank you for all that you do here at Columbia. I couldn't get into Columbia, so I appreciate you reminding all the folks here. Y'all took one of our, I should say, so many of my great friends from Penn are graduates of this wonderful institution, and I'm honored to be here. To the Smith Foundation, thank you for having us and for all that you do in promoting and sponsoring open and fair and free dialogue. One of the great tragedies of politics in the public space today is there doesn't seem to be the premium that was once placed on big ideas and bold ideas, even when we may disagree with them. So to have that tradition restored and promoted and executed in a big way here at this wonderful school is a great thing. I might also add that you, even though I went to Michigan, I think the head of y'all's university was trained at Michigan, so we are glad that President Bollinger is doing a fine job here at this great school of this. This debate about civil rights education, vouchers, no vouchers, charters, public schools, is really one that has raged for some time, and I have tremendous respect for Clint, who has been not only on the front line on this issue, but has the scars to show it and prove it. We've not always agreed on the approach and have not always agreed on, we've always agreed on a desire, I should say, at a shared outcome, but we've not always agreed that his approach was necessarily the right approach. But what we have agreed on is that that things aren't working as they should be in many of our schools across our country. I come from a city and had the blessing of representing essentially the city of Memphis in Congress for 10 years. And like a lot of urban areas, we are a top 20 ranked urban area and probably have the characteristics of a city ranked 15 to 20. When you consider the progress that our schools have made and have not made, and I thank the student organizations who've been a part of this as well and for your good work. We have found ourselves in Memphis, and I use it as an example because I think it speaks or is representative of some of the challenges that schools across our nation are facing. We have tried and tried and tried again. We have put a little more money incrementally in year after year. We recently passed in our state a few years ago a charter school law that is weaker than what we passed in the Congress, and I've been an unapologetic supporter of charters in the Congress. Matter of fact, of the only few voucher votes that we've had in the Congress, I think I was the only Democrat that voted in favor, largely because the mayor of the town, you may not want to clap after this, but the mayor of the town of Washington asked for it and came to the office and said, if I were a governor, you would give me this authority. I would have the authority to do the things that I want to do. And since Washington is, people are not allowed to vote, or should say don't have a representative in the Congress or can't vote for a governor, I said, you know what, he deserves it. If this is what he wants, who are we to say if the people don't want it, then they will vote him out of office if they choose that or decide that what he wants doesn't work. So I voted in favor, not once, but twice. And I'm a believer, much like the great FDR was, that new conditions impose new requirements on us. And when a system that we all love and has worked so well over the years is not working as it should, we should be in the business of fixing it. Now, I hope that the conversation tonight can focus on something broader than whether a voucher worked in Cleveland or a voucher program may work in Utah, or whether or not some of the efforts that are underway in other states to pass voucher, cities or states to pass voucher plans will work. I hope that if the real purpose of this is to figure out how to make schools work again, then we have to be open-minded really to any set of ideas. I'm a product of private schools, public schools up to 6th grade, then private schools or private school in Washington. And it's very difficult for me. And at the end of the day, the reason I was able to vote as I have on some of these reform efforts, or for reform, is that it's just hard for me to reconcile how I thought it was okay for me because my parents had the resources to send me. And I think I had the will, the aptitude to be there. It's very difficult for me to say that other families don't deserve it. Now, where I differ with some in the voucher movement is that I think the voucher should be much larger. If we're going to have a voucher program, let's be serious about it. I went to a school in Washington called St. Albans. It costs a lot of money to go there. The amount of money they're talking about, and Clint and I were just talking, and Utah is a little different than Tennessee or Washington, D.C., but the amount of money varies from about $500 to $3,000. If we're serious about a voucher, why not look at what the most expensive private school in that area is to attend, peg that as the number for what the voucher will be for kids who are in failing schools, and give those kids an opportunity to go out, and if they can't find entry into St. Albans, create a real market where those who are serious, not just rhetorically serious, but actually serious, action-wise serious about changing the quality and delivery of education in this country, give them the opportunity to do something that, frankly, and I'm not going to take much longer, give them the opportunity to create markets in cities and rural areas and states all across this country. One of the things that we have seen, and I hope that Clint will address, because I think part of what he's done is help to create great acceleration for this movement, is this homeschooling movement, which is growing by leaps and bounds, particularly in the part of the country where I'm from. And in a lot of ways, I think that the voucher plan and the homeschooling, or this idea of creating a new market for schools and education outlets to spring up in communities across the nation, is really a byproduct, or I should say homeschooling is a byproduct of people saying the vouchers aren't coming as we want them, public schools aren't working as they should, we'll take it upon ourselves to do it. And I believe if you gave people the resources to find and seek, or should say seek and find a good education for their kids, they would do that. Now, there are those who worry that if we switch from a private to a public model, you're siphoning money from the public system. And that's a legitimate argument. I think it's one that we can work through. Because most of the people who make that argument, their kids are in private schools. And God bless you and bless your heart for making that argument. And I'd rather go to the customer base who's actually suffering in schools that aren't teaching their kids what their kids need to learn to get a job, where so many parents in New York want their kids to work, wherever that may be. So I just think in fairness to these young people, we've got to think more broadly and be willing to challenge ourselves to think outside of a voucher box. There's some here who are friends of mine who have been great, great champions and who have not only put their mouths, but put their money where their mouths are in ensuring that kids would have a better opportunity. But I would challenge all of us to go above and beyond that and think about a larger model, because if we switch to vouchers tonight, we could wave a wand. The reality is we'd probably have the same set of challenges immediately that we have on the public school side. Overcrowded schools, not enough teachers, not enough qualified teachers. I mean, vouchers are a great term, but it's a great concept, but when you put it to practice, there's an infrastructure that would be needed on that side that you would certainly need and clearly need on the public school side. So I would hope tonight, whether Clint and I get to fighting up here or arm wrestling, or we get to agreeing, or we get to agreeing on some and disagreeing on others, I would hope that at the end of the evening that we would all walk out wanting to make schools better and being committed to whatever strategy, whatever plan works. Because in some areas, public schools and school choice may be the option and can work because of the way the system is organized. Vouchers may work in a part of a system. Charters may work in a part of a system. I just find it difficult to say no because there are people who believe that somehow or another that this voucher thing is such a cruel and evil way to go about educating kids. I ask you this question: if your child was stuck in a PS with a number on it that wasn't teaching your child what you wanted, what would you do? I was blessed. I had a mom and dad that could send me to a school called St. Albans. I don't think most parents have that option. And we in the public space, and even those in the public policy space and in the academic space, we have an obligation to find answers and to stop yelling. I look forward to the debate and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks to the Smith Family Foundation for hosting this forum, to Professor Hamburger for moderating and for providing some wonderful research scholarship on the First Amendment issue. There are so many friends in the audience, and one I want to acknowledge in particular is my friend John Stossel, who did the best indictment of our current system of education ever, called Stupid in America. I have argued before the United States Supreme Court, and I've been interviewed by John Stossel, and I have to tell you, arguing in the Supreme Court is a breeze compared to being interviewed by John. So thank you, John, so much. Last year was a particularly good year for school choice. As Professor Hamburger mentioned, a number of school choice plans were passed. But most important symbolically was the fact that last year was the year when the President of the United States endorsed school choice. Here I refer not to President George W. Bush, but far more importantly, President Jed Bartlet on West Wing endorsed school choice. And you gotta figure, if it can happen in Hollywood, it definitely ought to be able to happen in New York. Well, this was a case of art imitating life, because as Congressman Ford mentioned, and it's such a pleasure to appear on a forum with Congressman Ford, who was one of the most thoughtful legislators in recent years, and a true bipartisan spirit in a town that lacks that horribly now. But as Congressman Ford mentioned, we did help to enact a school choice program in our nation's capital city. Our nation's capital city is a beacon of freedom in the world, and yet has one of the worst public educational systems in the entire country. But never has the need for educational options been so great. 10 years ago, Stephen and Abigail Thernstrom found that the average black high school senior graduated in an academic level 3 years behind their white counterparts. 10 years later, billions of dollars of spending later, that academic gap has changed. It is now 4 years. It has actually grown. Nearly half of all black and Hispanic youngsters fail to graduate from high school on time, and that dropout rate has grievous consequences. Among young black men who failed to graduate from high school, over a quarter of them are in jail today. No, I am not a huge fan of the No Child Left Behind Act, but there are certain aspects of it that I think are very significant for this discussion. According to the Department of Education, there are 4 million kids in chronically failing schools. That is, schools that by the state's own standards have been failing for at least 6 consecutive years. What could possibly be the argument for keeping those kids in those schools? Well, No Child Left Behind does have a solution, and that is that all of those children technically are entitled to transfer to better performing public schools within the district. Except, guess what? There aren't nearly enough seats in those schools. So what No Child Left Behind has demonstrated, I think, beyond any debate, is that public schools alone cannot solve the crisis of inner city public education. We must look for every possible solution. Like Congressman Ford, I totally support every proposal that represents meaningful reform in education, accountability measures, charter schools, passionately support them. The mayor's takeover plan here in New York and the chancellor's efforts to deregulate public schools here in New York City. But they cannot succeed until we embrace private school options as well, for two reasons. First, school choice, including private schools alone, offers the opportunity for kids in failing schools to transfer today to good schools. And in that regard, private school choice represents an educational life preserver for kids in abysmal, failing schools. Second, only private school choice creates the competition necessary to boost public school performance. The rules of economics are not suspended at the doors of the schoolhouse. There are dueling studies about school choice. You've probably heard a recent study that shows that in the aggregate, private schools are not any better than public schools in terms of academic performance. But there are three types of studies in which there is no debate whatsoever. The first is that every study that has examined the effects of private school choice, where you have a random selection process, and some kids got in and some kids didn't, and you were comparing those two sets of kids, every single one of those gold standard studies shows improved academic performance for the kids in private schools. Every study that has examined the effects of private school choice on integration, economic and racial, have shown increased integration in private school choice programs. And for that reason, people like William Taylor, the head of the Citizens Commission on Civil Rights, have begun to embrace school choice. And finally, and most importantly, every study that has examined the effects of competition on the public schools has found improved performance among public schools when they are exposed to meaningful competition from either charter schools or voucher schools. School choice is the tide that lifts all boats. The closure of Catholic schools in the inner city is a national calamity. Eliot Spitzer recognized this when he was running for governor, and he vowed to do something about it, but when push came to shove, he wimped out. And the proposal that he put before the legislature was feeble, to put it mildly. Across the river, by contrast, Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, has remained firm and a stalwart supporter of school choice, and I believe that he will show the way out of failing public schools. I wish that Congressman Ford was still in the United States Senate, because at the national level, unlike the state and local level, this remains a fiercely partisan issue. At the state and local level, it is quite different. Last year, of 11 school choice programs that were passed or expanded, 7 were in states with Democratic governors. Janet Napolitano became the first Democratic governor to sign into law 2 voucher programs, one for kids in foster care, one for kids with special needs. This year, Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell became the first Democratic governor to propose an expansion of an existing private school choice program. But at the national level, Democrats, I believe, have a big problem, and I hope that we can discuss this over the course of the evening for 2 reasons on this issue. First is something that Congressman Ford alluded to, and I think it's a very important point. I call it the H factor, the hypocrisy factor, of the leading Democratic candidates or potential candidates for President of the United States. Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, and John Edwards, all strongly opposed to school choice. All of them sent their own kids to private schools. When Bill Clinton vetoed school choice for the District of Columbia in 1995, Polly Williams, the godmother of school choice, a Democratic legislator from Wisconsin, said, you know, Bill and Hillary should not be the only people who live in public housing who get to send their kids to private schools. And Barack Obama has yet to take a firm position on school choice, but he too sends his child to private schools. The second thing is that this issue pits 2 key Democratic constituencies against each other. The teacher unions, which are of course passionately opposed to school choice, and blacks and Hispanics who desperately need it and support it in huge numbers. If Republicans ever get a clue about the saliency of the school choice issue in the inner city, Democrats could be in serious jeopardy of ceding the crown jewel in their domestic policy arsenal. I want to close with an anecdote. Professor Hamburger aptly set the stage of us being so far removed from the goals of Brown versus Board of Education more than 50 years later. When I was litigating these issues, I always found it very helpful to make sure that the parents and children were not only represented in the courtroom, but were physically present there. The esoteric issues that were being debated could be made much more concrete if the children who would benefit from these programs are physically present in the courtroom. The first time I debated this issue, or argued this issue, in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, we arranged for a busload of children to come with us from Milwaukee to Madison. And unbeknownst to me, along the way, the bus broke down. And when the courtroom opened, it quickly filled to capacity, but the children were not there. Well, the bus was repaired, and as it was time for me to move to the podium to make my argument, I was walking over, and the doors leading into the Wisconsin Supreme Court are glass doors. And the kids had arrived, and I looked back, and on the outside of the door, I saw this row of little noses pressed against the glass. And I thought to myself, what a metaphor for what's going on here, the kids on the outside looking in. When that court upheld the program, and when states around the country have adopted more school choice programs, those kids who have always been on the outside have come inside now. This is the civil rights issue of our generation. We have within our power the chance to make good on the promise of equal educational opportunities for every child in this country. And it is our moral imperative to do just that. Please join in the effort to do so. Thank you for having me, and go get them.
So let's now give each of our speakers 5 minutes to add to what they have to say or to respond or something like that. And then I'll have some questions for them. You want to just go straight to this?
We give it up. We just open up.
Wow. To a law professor, the idea of giving up a chance to speak is it's an act of generosity that we're just quite accustomed to. Right. Thank you. Well, let me throw a question at both of you then, and let's begin by just framing this in the broadest legal terms. I think we've already had a discussion that's at a level and at a tone that's most unusual and deeply appealing, but I'd like to turn to some specifics. In particular, is it the federal government or the states that should be dealing with this? Obviously, there's a constitutional level to this question, but there are also questions of competition and experimentation and certain risks that go with that. And it'd be interesting to hear what each of you have to say about that.
Sure.
Please turn your microphone on.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. First off, I thank Clint for the kind words. He said he wished I was still innocent. I just wish I'd made it. But you're very kind. You're very kind. Two things. One, I think increasingly the federal government will have to play a role in what happens in our schools. I mean, the No Child Left Behind Act obviously was the single largest intrusion on the federal government's part in a whole spectrum of decisions made about how kids are educated and what goes into that education and what happens when those kids fail, or those schools fail, I should say. There's been a lot of talk about a lot of times when we talk about vouchers, about race. And there's a lot of referencing, as rightly so, about the Brown v. Board. And the interesting thing, I'd love to even hear Professor Hamburger's take on this. I mean, Brown v. Board was about ensuring that everybody could go to school. And No Child Left Behind, vouchers, charters, the reform conversation is about what happens when kids are in school. And I think we sometimes get so caught up in trying to defend, and Clint has been great on his front. Again, we don't see eye to eye about all of this, but I do see eye to eye on him on trying to bring about change. Now, I see a larger role for the federal government, not in an encroachment or in them explaining or dictating what happens at the local level. But I just believe that if America expects to be competitive, then we're going to have to set some standards. Whatever we want to say about Democrats, and I pause when and get a little irritated when I hear people make this kind of a partisan thing, because, I mean, Democrats hadn't stopped reform and Republicans hadn't advanced it so greatly. So this is really an American issue. The reality is Bill Clinton was the first one to impose standards. He did it over the cries of some in his own party and over the cries of some in the Republican Party. So we could cite, things about what Republicans do, what Democrats do, and I love Cory Booker. I don't know if he's Democrat or Republican, but I love the guy, and I wish him the very best in Newark. And I pray for him, and I pray for his governor, and I know we all extend our prayers to the families and really the larger Virginia Tech University family. That being said, I would envision a larger, more constructive role for the federal government, where the federal government would partner with states and local governments. It's awkward kind of looking back at you like this, but would be able to partner better and partner more with state and local governments to meet the needs of their customers. I mean, I work for a bank now, and we structure our products to meet the needs of our customers. That's what we should do in schools also. In the federal government, I envision a role where they would partner with states and local governments, much like they partner essentially with the private sector to create incentives for us to do all kinds of things that we believe make sense. So generically, yes, I see a larger role too. I think that has to be worked out with the individual states. Utah's needs would differ from Tennessee's needs. And public schools, or the education system in our country, regrettably, is still the system that believes that one size fits all, and it doesn't. I mean, you have kids in private schools. There are different things that happen in different private schools, and even when kids are learning at home, there's a different pace. So we have to recognize that just because a child is unfortunately finds him or herself in a school that's not working right, which is not teaching them, that we shouldn't be in the business of saying, look, we'll take you out of there and throw you over here, because going over here doesn't guarantee an education. What we ought to be doing, and Clint, I know, agrees with this, we ought to be finding settings where these kids, if their needs are, they have very little instruction at home and they have very little reinforcement of what they're doing at school, then we have to put them in a setting where they have that. And we in government, or those of us in the public policy space, at some level, we can't just complain that parents need to be more involved, because all the things that Clint mentioned with charters and vouchers, it's really parental involvement. If parents are involved, really good things happen in school. So how do we get more parents involved in taking into account that some may not be? And I think government has a role to play when parents and when those other support systems are not there. And hopefully, as a part of this larger debate about education, we can get to a serious conversation about what happens from birth to 5, because I know your data and Clint's data would have to show that may be the most important period. It's amazing how God works, but that may be the most important period in a child's life, a child's education experience.
If I could just say, this raises some important questions, because if the federal government's already so involved, it may have to be involved perhaps with charter schools, and perhaps it's the source of money. Do you agree with that? How would you see the division between?
First of all, let me say that the mention of Harold Ford being in the Senate was not a Freudian slip. It turns out there were a number of hanging chads, and he is the duly elected senator there. But I think that the federal government probably at this point has a role in establishing a baseline for educational access, with the goal of returning greater control to the states when they demonstrate that they have the capacity and the willingness to do so. So I would like to see a very rigorous No Child Left Behind Act paired with an opportunity for states to get out from under the No Child Left Behind Act when they demonstrate that they have serious accountability and choice mechanisms that will make the opportunities meaningful. But ultimately, in one area where I part company with a lot of conservatives, there seems to be a nostalgic attachment among conservatives to local control over education. And it's at the local level where a lot of the worst problems exist. Madison was the first to point out, perhaps, that at the local level, you have the greatest opportunity for control of government by special interests. And that's exactly what you often happen with school board elections with, 5 or 10% of the people voting and the unions dominate and so forth. So I think conservatives have really missed the boat on the decentralization. They stop 2 levels too soon. We ought to devolve authority to the maximum possible extent to the school level and to the level of the individual parent. And even with educational financing, I would like to see states put an equal amount of money behind every single child, and the money would follow the child wherever the child was able to obtain an educational experience. Congressman Ford mentioned homeschooling, for example. A kid sitting in front of a computer at home learning is accomplishing the goals of public education. We should care much less about where a child is being educated and much more about whether a child is being educated. And if the child and the parent have found a way to achieve education, we should back that up with the funds that are earmarked for public education. One last point of agreement here with Congressman Ford. Congressman Ford said that he thought that vouchers, if they're to be meaningful, ought to be much larger. And with some arm twisting, I am willing to agree to that compromise.
Well, I can't help following up then by asking about the implications for all of the experimentation and competition that hopefully would follow from the stream of charter schools across the nation. To the degree federal money enters into state matters, we usually see a degree of federal standards, which can be very useful, as was suggested, and yet also can homogenize education and can stand in the way of the very competition, experimentation, the hopes to find something that works a little bit better. So I can see great risks as well as great opportunities, and since there does seem to be much agreement on this between the two of you, perhaps you nonetheless would be able to each tell me why it is some of us should not fear that, in fact, with federal money will actually come federal control of good sorts as well, of bad sorts as well as good sorts.
Well, if that is a concern of yours, and it's probably a legitimate concern, what difference does it make? Because the kids aren't learning now. So, I mean, if the end goal, I mean, I'm not as concerned about who's in charge, who's in control. And I think the point that Clint makes about it's whether a kid is learning and where a child is learning. I mean, it may be a slight relationship. I mean, I don't blame, matter of fact, I support parents who want to take the education of their kids into their own hands and teach at home. But at the same time, I think there's some value to kids interacting with one another and being around one another. So there's, to each kid and to each family, it may work differently. I know we probably wouldn't disagree on that. The way I envision a federal role is working in partnership or in conjunction with locals and state governments. I'll give you a different example. I had a chance to meet a young fellow who now runs NASCAR. He was about number 2 or number 3 at NASCAR a few years ago. And he came to me to ask this question about how, or one of his deputies came to ask, how in Memphis could they attract more African Americans to come to the races, the truck races and car races. And, I had never been to a truck race. I've been to NASCAR. I mean, I've been up to Bristol to watch up on the other side of Tennessee for a race, but I've never been to a truck race. So, just so happened that day, Boykin and Curry, I'm upset because the president had minused out money for this gifted program for gifted students in our schools. And as a result, there was a school in my district, a few schools benefited from it. There's a school that had a marketing class. And the marketing class was reserved for the gifted students. You only qualified for this class. I guess it was a fun, interesting class to take, and you had to be academically accomplished to take the class. So they ended this class. And the students had all written me. I was reading on the plane, had about 60 letters from them. I said, I'm just going to go by the school and explain to them how upset I am also that we've made this cut. But in between going by the school and getting off the plane, I had to see these guys from this NASCAR thing. So as they got to talking about how to get more African Americans to go to NASCAR, I didn't know how to get them. I said, well, look, why don't we go to the experts? I said, it's funny, I would see y'all in between getting off the plane and going out to see these kids. Why don't you all organize a program and fund this class in our schools, the marketing class in the 6 schools that have had their program minused out because there's no more federal money, and give them the task of figuring out how to get more African Americans and young black kids that want to go to NASCAR. And they looked at me like I was half crazy. I felt about half crazy saying it because I just kind of thought of it. Turns out they do it. And the program worked. I mean, these kids put forward a set of ideas that kept them thinking and learning and engaged, and it saved the program. So where there are ways to find partnerships that make sense, nobody gave up any control. The kids actually enjoyed the not only the project, but appreciated the exposure to something they probably would not have been exposed to. And it was a win-win for everybody because NASCAR probably would have had to pay some firm up here a lot more money to figure it out than actually go to the kids in the city that they actually wanted to affect, saying, what can we do to get you to attend? That's a small anecdote. But I think there are ways to draw from that where you're able to balance the local and outside and federal control in a way that would work for kids. And the way you measure it, it was real easy to measure there because NASCAR wouldn't keep doing it if they weren't seeing increased numbers. And it'd be real easy to determine the reason, not like No Child Left Behind, because it holds students, it holds schools accountable, which is a good thing. Whether you're for vouchers or against them, you got to be for knowing whether or not a kid is reading at first grade level after first grade. You got to be for knowing if they're performing math at 5th grade levels when they graduate 5th grade. Regardless of what your thinking is on Clint, me, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, or Republicans, we all should be in the business of trying to ensure that they get educated. I feel like Clint and I should be fighting or something, so forgive me. I'm trying to get this wrapped up. I don't know what I'm trying to do.
I do fear federal control, and I think in program after program, one perfect example is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Massive federal requirements, very little federal funding going along with it, and so the states and local governments have to spend a lot of money complying with this law. But I do think the federal government plays a very important role, again, in ensuring baseline opportunities, but also, I think, in being somewhat of an honest broker. And a good example is in Arizona. Most kids have to take the NAEP exam, or all kids have to take the NAEP exam, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And then, of course, they take their state tests. And in Arizona, we implemented this really tough new state test called AIMS. And lo and behold, same thing that's happened in just about every state with a serious test. The vast majority of kids flunk the exam. So the state education officials say, this is unacceptable, this is just absolutely terrible, we've got to do something about these low test scores. And of course what they did was to lower the passing score. And lo and behold, all of a sudden our kids are doing so much better. Except when you compare the Arizona scores with the NAEP scores. The NAEP scores are the same, the Arizona scores have gone way up. And I think that it's very important for the federal government to provide testing that shows whether a state's tests are bogus or not. So that's one of the functions I think that the federal government gainfully can do.
Well, thank you. So let's turn the question a little bit more local now. We have both of you here in New York City, and New York City has some of the same problems that we have across the country, but that may matter to us in New York City more immediately. What advice would you give to New Yorkers? What should New York be doing?
I would say one thing that it ought to be doing is applying Mr. Klein's wonderful expertise in antitrust law to the public school monopoly. If there is one monopoly that really needs a dose of competition, it's exactly that. And I really do think that Joel Klein is probably the best chancellor of New York public schools ever. And that but still his hands are incredibly tied. This is one city that really needs an education revolution, and I just don't think that the existing structure will enable it to do so. My friend Eva Moskowitz, who served on the city council and is now heading a charter school, has documented the amazing union contracts that control every aspect of what goes on in the schools. It's just got to be busted. Just like the trusts were busted a century ago, so too does the special interest control over education have to be busted. And I think that school choice is absolutely crucial in accomplishing that. I actually have more hope when you're speaking local. If you can expand that to my home state of New Jersey, I have more hope that revolution is going to take place in New Jersey. The old adage that things have to get worse before they get better, it's worse in New Jersey. And you're now spending over $18,000 per student in the Newark, sorry, I see 21,000. Do I hear 22? In the Newark public schools. And you're paying elite private school prices for a third world quality education. And there is now a class action lawsuit in New Jersey that my friends at E3 are helping to prosecute. 60,000 kids in schools that are failing horribly by the state's standards, demanding the only remedy that will make them whole, and that is the opportunity to go to a better school, public or private, with the money that's set forth for their education. If the constitutional guarantee of a thorough and efficient education is worth the paper that it is written on, that lawsuit will succeed, and it will be the best thing that ever happened to public schools in New Jersey, because they will shake off the forces of lethargy and inertia that have prevented them from moving into the 21st century.
Thank you. Do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I won't be long. I believe in accountability and leadership, and if a mayor wants to take charge and be willing to accept the responsibility for it, then fair enough. He's got to win the support of, hopefully win at least partial support, if not majority support, from many of the constituencies. But unfortunately, kids can't vote. I've always said if children could vote, they'd vote all of us out of office year after year for all the lies we'd tell them about what we would do and how we were going to do it. As I listened to Clint in his first set of remarks, because I don't think Professor Hamburger is convinced yet on our federal component or the federalization to an extent of education. You look at our prison system, and Clint mentioned it first. I watched a series the other night on one of these national television news shows. I think it might have been 60 Minutes, where these guys are in jail now and they're learning 18th century European literature and how fascinated and engaged they are with it. And I thought, we waited till they kill somebody, till they rape somebody, till they rob somebody before we realized that there might have been this interest. And what it really was putting them in a setting where they could learn, where they felt comfortable, where they felt challenged. It might also help that it was compulsory, but at the same time, they felt they're in a setting where they for some reason or another, they've opened up, which just, it leads me to, the federal government should be involved, but you got to partner again with those who are administering what's happening at the local level. Clint's dead on when he says there ought to be some national standards, because you don't want states just dumbing down these tests. I'll give you a 30-second example. I was so frustrated in my district when so many of my kids would fail our state exam to graduate from high school. You qualified, like in all these states, for a certificate but not a diploma if you didn't pass the state test. So I would go and tutor kids that had failed it twice. And sat with this group of kids, about 5 of them, and they'll never forget it. A school called Booker T. Washington High School. East High School in Memphis. There were kids in Booker T. Washington High School there. And stood in the room and looked at some sample questions and all. And one of the sample questions I thought was pretty straightforward, and it didn't require a whole lot of computation, but just had to read through it. It read very simply. It was an 8th grade math. And it read through, which in and of itself I think speaks to what your point, that you can't expect kids to excel in a marketplace like the one we're dealing in today with an 8th grade math understanding. Nonetheless, the question was, I remember vividly, it said, if you had $20, hot dogs cost $4, Coca-Colas cost $3, and you bought 3 hot dogs and 2 Cokes, would you have enough money? If so, how much left over? And it gave the different options, A, B, C, and D. And I'm sitting there looking at the kids, and they're all looking at me just like y'all look at me right now. No movement, just kind of like almost waiting for what's next. What are you going to say next? I said, well, let's work through this. So about 10 seconds of complete inertia and total discomfort on my part. I said, look, why don't we start working through this? I said, what's 3 hot dogs? What's 3 times 4? Hands shot up. 12. What's 2 times 3? 6. I said, well, come on, somebody tell me what the answer is. And still nobody really looked at me. They kind of looked at me like I was about strange. And they said, it's 18. And kid said, BC. He had $2 left over. I said, who didn't understand this? And I'm looking at the 5. It's four young men and a young lady. And they're looking at me still kind of dazed, just kind of crazy looking. And finally, one of them raised their hand in the back and said, Congressman Ford. He said, we knew the answer. He said, but I just had one problem. He goes, who the heck pays $4 for a hot dog? And he obviously hadn't been to one of our professional basketball games in Memphis where you do that. But it got me to thinking that they're bringing to it a whole set of cultural norms that you and I bring when we take these tests. But guess what? We're used to paying $4 for a hot dog. We're used to paying $3 for a Coca-Cola. Now, I'm not saying that we have to culturally adjust tests, but we have to be aware as we talk about teaching kids and meeting kids where they are to help them get to the place that we ultimately want them. And I think the federal government's role in not just in providing resources, but setting standards is a good thing. And the only good part, the upside to the No Child Left Behind, is that it holds these schools accountable, gives these kids options, but it goes right back to the point Clint made in his opening remarks. Where do they go if the schools are failing? There's no place for them to go. And I'm not convinced fully yet that vouchers alone will solve that. I think vouchers and charters and even fixing our public schools have to be part of the overall mix, because when you look at the volume of kids or the size of our public school system, you just can't switch them all to another system now, again, without inviting the same set of challenges and problems we have on the public school side. I know Clint's sensitive to this. He's just looking at how do you ensure that you don't allow, I think the way I interpret and the reason I support him is that support a lot of what he says, that you got to take the monopoly. I don't like monopolies. I just think they're bad. Unless you own it. I mean, but other than owning it, it's not a good thing. And as much as Klein, in his role as Assistant Attorney General for antitrust issues, broke up these trusts, understand that when we talk about schools and education, I mean, a lot of our teachers are good people. They're not bad people. And a lot of them want, and I know you know this as well, they want nothing but the best for their students. And we've got to shake the system up a bit. But I think when some approach this as if these people are bad people, as if they want nothing but they want our kids to fail. Many of them, I dare say the overwhelming majority of them do not. And I got a teacher in my district who defends me even as I support all these charters. She used to be the head of the Tennessee Education Association. So whenever I support charters, I supported the voucher program, I called her and she called all the NEA folks and said, y'all leave my little boy alone. Let him vote the way he wants to vote. So if I get in trouble today, I'm going to have her call you as well.
Well, thank you. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left, and I don't think we should leave before we touch upon a peculiarly sensitive topic that I know many people are concerned about, which is religion. And here in New York, of course, public schools for a long time were means of inculcating a certain Protestantism. And a Protestant ethos persisted in the public schools for a long time, leaving Catholics to find education on their own in private schools, hence the strength for a long time of parochial schools. And this leads to questions about, is there awkwardness or even a constitutional issue here in funding through vouchers or other means through charter schools? We only have very limited time left, but perhaps if you each could take a minute or two on this, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Look, the Constitution speaks loudly and clearly on this, and any desire to break this up is going to not only face opposition, but rightly so face it, because if indeed you allow for the funding of a religious education or an education that has a complete religious bent to it, then you have to open it up for everyone. And I know there's scholarship that argues both ways on this, but look, at the end of the day, we're trying to teach kids. I went to an Episcopal school, Episcopalian tradition, but it was a private school, wasn't public money, wasn't public dollars going forward. The reality is we ought to figure out how to teach kids, and if They learn how to, if they learn something else that we want them to learn because of our faith, fair enough. But we should be in the interest, as Clint said so well, of teaching kids the basics and what they need to know to succeed in life.
I think there's one issue in which the U.S. Supreme Court got it exactly right, and that is just like the GI Bill, just like Pell Grants, if parents or students are choosing where to spend the dollars that are earmarked for their children's education, there's no constitutional problem. Where the constitutional problem is arising is in state constitutions that often have constitutional amendments that trace to precisely that bigoted period that Professor Hamburger mentioned. And it really bothers me to watch people who consider themselves to be civil libertarians wrapping themselves in constitutional provisions that are born of bigotry. And I am very hopeful that when the U.S. Supreme Court gets a case that squarely presents the issue of whether a state can discriminate against religious schools in an otherwise applicable school choice program, that it will put that doctrine along with many other discredited, bigoted doctrines to rest once and for all.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers for this marvelous conversation. Clint Bolick and Harold Ford are both profoundly knowledgeable about these subjects, and I think this is a model of the sort of conversation that I wish would take place on a wider scale. And so perhaps someone will watch this and imitate it. It's both intellectually stimulating and, as I said, at just the right tone that we need in this country. I also want to thank the Smith Family Foundation for funding this, and the Federalist Society and Columbia University Law School for hosting it. And thank you, of course, to all of you in the audience, too, for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you very much.